This is KAZU in Pacific Grove, California. It is broadcast number 603, June 27th, 1983. I usually go over what we were discussing a year ago this evening to see how the news has shaped up in the past year. It'd be fun to do broadcasts going back to a year ago, 2 years ago, and 3 years ago on the same date. That would take up the whole hour, but it would be an interesting format. A year ago this week, broadcast number 551, I was talking about Raymond Donovan and his links to the organized crime families and articles from the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and San Francisco Chronicle suggesting that it's time for Raymond Donovan to go. Article in the San Jose Mercury linking him and his construction business to organized crime figures. Well, Raymond Donovan is still in the White House, and as I mentioned last week, Ronald Reagan owes his presidency to a network of the crime syndicate, and his campaign is run by Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada, who is not bashful about his contacts with the organized crime figures. And so long as Frank Sinatra gives the songs and the inaugural ball and Paul Laxalt runs the campaign fund money for the Republican Party, and William Casey ran the financial campaign for Ronald Reagan when he was involved with the Security Exchange Commission and Robert Vesco and Bernie Cornfield, there's no way to get the mob out of the White House, and Raymond Donovan is still there. Alexander Haig was gone a year ago today, and in came George Shultz, who at one time was Secretary of Labor, again working with Richard Nixon and the Teamsters and Frank Fitzsimmons and Jimmy Hoffa, the whole team, and he was from Bechtel Organization, but he also had cabinet positions with Richard Nixon, which combined both the Nazis and the organized crime syndicate. Ronald Reagan was in Houston, Texas, and we talked about that last week in his visit to Houston. Edwin Wilson came home with $18 million, even though he'd been arrested in Switzerland. And I said a year ago tonight that Arafat would be sacrificed. The part of the deal of Edwin Wilson coming home was that Arafat would be sacrificed. And this week, Arafat was kicked out of Lebanon and Syria, and he was indeed given the boot. Israel was given the permission to go in and clean out the PLO and do the massacre, and there were controversial articles in the newspaper this week how the government concealed, the General Accounting Office, the millions of dollars given to Israel to literally clean out those people over there in Lebanon. And in return for Israel continuing to be a military base to make war against the Soviet Union and to protect the Saudi Arabian families that are practically down on their knees, believe it or not, Israel will defend Saudi Arabia and help us crush or try to crush Israel. Jack Anderson had a story about the Saudi family and oil today. And I was talking about Edwin Wilson. And also, Roberta Calvi was dead in London June the 18th, and the original story was suicide. And a year ago, I was saying it was murder. It was cold-blooded murder. And this week they were opening up the case in London again, and they said the water tide that went up to his body, it would have been impossible for him to have been there hanging at the time. He was brought there dead, obviously, and hung as the tide went out. It hadn't gone up a certain part of his body, and now they're just about agreeing all out that it is murder. So those are some of the things we talked about last year, but this year they're still in the news. And for some new listeners or people that may not always be aware of it, the names that I use and the incidences I use are carefully selected because they belong to a fabric of information that will always, in some shape or form, recur over and over again until those cases are settled. There are two short items I want to bring up before I get to one particular theme this evening and continue with Robert Byron Watson and Colonel Charles Willoughby and that can of worms, the fascist element in this country. There's a story called News Crews Expecting the Worst, Prepare to Cover a Major Earthquake in California. Sometime in August, I told you I'm going to do 2 or 3 broadcasts on the Olympic Games and the CIA and the fear that I have for what's going down in Los Angeles. But this was in the Wall Street Journal this last week, June 25th, 1983. And this is the story, in essence, what it says is all over Los Angeles, people are mystified. CBS Network News crew are suddenly taping scenes downtown and all over Los Angeles, and CBS has the most elaborate battle plan to cover the major California earthquake. They're getting ready for the big one. the Associated Press, United Press, CBS. But it was the instructions of the story that really scared me. They said that they're treating the big one as if it were a convention or the Olympics. Now, the amount of deaths in Los Angeles will be equal to the Civil War deaths. They're expecting hundreds of thousands. It says thousands and thousands will be killed. They're expecting something there, and what they want to show on the East Coast is what Los Angeles looked like before the big one. But what is so scary about this is that they have specific instructions that I think this writer from the Wall Street Journal caught on and put in the newspaper for you to see. They mentioned a particular man who would get out of the rubble. He's supposed to climb out of the rubble. Douglas R. Dowie, D-O-W-I-E. He's a former United Press International reporter. He's to climb out of rubble and head for the low-income south central section of Los Angeles to see if looting erupts. Now, if that isn't racism, I mean, what of Century City or Mid-Wilshire or downtown, the high-rise or the multi-national investment of apartments down Wilshire Boulevard in Westwood? Are they making racism out of this is an event where thousands and thousands will be killed, and they want to see how a few black people looted the stores? Does that remind you when Martin Luther King was killed, how the black part of town of Detroit or Los Angeles or Washington was photographed, and Louis Tackwood in 1971 surfaced from the police department and told how agent provocateurs were sent as provocateurs to riot, but not to handle the emergencies. I have other articles on the emergencies. A particular man is to photograph that part of town. Now, how do they know he's going to be under rubble? The other thing that really was interesting to me was that they were supposed to go 7 blocks or 8 blocks, the reporters. They have a plan distributed to the Associated Press. An able-bodied reporter in Los Angeles bureau is supposed to take his transistor radio and make his way 8 blocks north to a building that houses the Pacific Telephone microwave transmission facility. Now, how do they know that anyone will be alive 8 blocks from that building? So that they have all these plans to show somebody what happened before and after. And I think they could drop a Nagasaki or Hiroshima. That would write out Ronald Reagan's mafia contacts in Century City for sure. All the banks, the Wells Fargo and Bank of America, clean them out. But what are they planning that they tell these people, you go 8 blocks to here? What if that is all closed off? I mean, in other words, it was too specific for my satisfaction. I didn't like the words or going to the black part of town. I call this carefully planned racism, even at the time of tragedy. There's another story in our local newspaper that caught my eye. A gentleman who has a music school here in Monterey Peninsula called Heinrich Bender, B-E-N-D-E-R, former Africa Corps bandmaster, A-F-R-I-K-A Corps, K-O-R-P-S bandmaster, Heinrich Bender. He teaches at Monterey Peninsula College the third Saturday of the month, and he has a band, and he worked for Rommel's band. He worked first in Hesse in Germany, H-E-S-S-E, and in North Africa with Rommel. And by 1943, the Americans took him until the war was over. He came to the United States as a prisoner of war, but he was playing German music for the British Army Field Hospital. He worked with the Hitler Rommel Corps in South Africa, and was brought to the United States. And what he wants to do in Monterey is to start a 201st Infantry Battalion of the California State Military Reserve Band. He wants a Monterey County band, having come from the German Army, degrees in German music, and he's a trombone player. He wants to have, with our military here on the peninsula, this band. He has a Bender School of Music. I remember in the book, Kurt Ries's book, Nazi Goes Underground, how they would take over the Bach festivals, which we have coming here pretty soon in another week or two, and the musical bands. And in that play, Good, that I referred to the story of how ordinary people become Nazis and rationalize. One of the things that Adolf Hitler did was, from the music hall up to the string quartets of Brahms and Beethoven and Chopin and Wagner, in between, every element of society had their particular German music. So I'm wondering if we'll have some Irving Berlin music or if we're going to have German music. And it just reminds me of things that I've read, it doesn't prove anything at all, and I don't even know how important it is or if it's happening all over the country. But I would like to think that Americans are making American band music for our 4th of July and not people that worked for Adolf Hitler and then moved to the Monterey Peninsula. Now, individually, you can teach the trombone, but stay out of the military. And obviously, he's been with the military ever since he was captured in 1943 and has worked with the Americans. Now, continuing part 3 of the story of Robert Byron Watson, the fellow who was in jail in Florida and federal prisons on some drug charges. He claimed he was framed. He worked with the gallery in Atlanta, Georgia, and Marietta, Georgia, where the mob, the syndicate, worked with Representative Larry McDonald, our most radical right-wing congressman at the present time. Larry McDonald's Western Goals has computers fed directly into the Los Angeles Police Department, into 50 police departments around the country. Partner with Roy Cohn, long syndicate associations, and Cohn with Permindex, the international outfit that killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. Robert Byron Watson was in an art gallery where they were discussing the murder of Martin Luther King the next week. He had told his mother about this when King was murdered. He surfaced after committees began investigating these murders. He contacted Bernard Fensterwald from the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, and Bernard was with the CIA, but Watson didn't know it. And then when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was formed, he thought, now I will have a chance to tell the story because they're going into the Martin Luther King murder, and these men also were talking about Sirhan and the Patsy, and it was a month later when Robert Kennedy was murdered, and they were talking about John Kennedy and laughing about that too. So 2 weeks ago, I read to you a letter that Watson sent to me when I first heard from him in December of 1976. And last week, I shared with you information from David Wemple, another researcher, telling me what he had gotten from Robert Watson. But I want to just share a quick letter that he wrote to me in 1977 in March when the House Select Committee was doing their work, and he was so enthusiastic. And just to show you the kind of thing he wrote, I just wanted to share a few sentences. He said, "Dear Mrs. Brussell, on Friday afternoon, I was allowed to place one call. Therefore, I spoke to Mr. Dick Gregory. I was told that the book that he and Mark Lane are doing, they had gone to see Robert Watson. They had interviewed him on Martin Luther King. He said, I was told the book that they co-authored about me and the assassination of Martin Luther King will be coming out in a month." He was very excited about that. The name will be Codename Zorro, and needless to say, the book will provide me with quite a bit of publicity about what he was trying to tell people about the assassinations and the headquarters for these particular people in Georgia. He said, "It expresses the issues involved in my incarceration in a federal prison and the issues arising out of my future testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I have been named as a key witness before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Recently, I was advised that some representatives of the House Select Committee on Assassinations will be flying down to see me in order to speak to me about my future testimony before said committee. The day is close at hand when I shall again have the attention of the news media focused upon me because earlier there were some articles in the paper in Atlanta, Georgia about him, and he felt now the truth will come out." Well, one reason Robert Byron Watson stopped writing to me was I told him all along, don't trust Mark Lane, don't trust Dick Gregory. I've mentioned to you before the role that Sylvia Marr played in Accessories After the Fact or in her index, leaving out the people from Munich, Germany that came to General Walker and Robert Morris and the John Birch Society for the role that they played in the murder of John Kennedy. She left out about 29 names and the important names to figure out who was behind the murder of John Kennedy. That's a very convenient index of names to leave that out and have people study history and go to those books. Well, Mark Lane and Dick Gregory went to see him. Dick Gregory was at my home and admitted he saw Robert Watson and they spent time with him. I said, "Why didn't you put anything in the book?" He said Prentice Hall wouldn't publish it. I've mentioned this to you before on broadcast, referred to it. They didn't mention him at all. He's a zero in the book. The House Select Committee came up with a final conclusion that they listened to Robert Byron Watson and ruled out what he said. They didn't investigate him. They didn't use him as a witness. There are volumes of the hearings. I have all the testimony. He was never called as a witness, and none of the figures from the syndicate were examined or questioned, and he was completely ignored, and he was totally crushed by it because the book came out, the committee opened and closed, and he had such anticipation that he lived in the land of the free in America, that the $6 million was to investigate, and he was just nailed. They didn't investigate. They covered up. They're geniuses at it. They truly are. And G. Robert Blakey and the whole committee ignored him totally. He didn't want to believe it, and so it's just a shame, but that's the way the cookie crumbles, and that's exactly what happened. I just wanted to share with you his optimism on the book and the committee, and then from then on it was a downer because nothing happened. Now, last week I briefly mentioned a subject of the POSSE COMITATUS because it was in the news, and there was a picture of Joe McCarthy in the newspaper, and I've been talking about him in conjunction with Richard, not only Richard Nixon, but Ronald Reagan and Robert Morris and Colonel Charles Willoughby. The article is called Militant Rightists, the POSSE COMITATUS Boss Claims Big Membership. This came out in the Monterey Herald and Associated Press Wire with a photograph of James Wickstrom holding a press conference. Now, I wanted to share some more of that article. The reason it came out was that Gordon Call, a member of the POSSE COMITATUS, who shot 2 federal marshals in North Dakota, had gone down to Arkansas and was in a barn with people not from the POSSE COMITATUS, but from another group, and they share and house each other, or people that have escaped from the law. And Gordon Call was murdered down in Arkansas, and his murder brought out information about James Wickstrom that is available some places, but most people are not familiar with it. Now, this article describes his location in Tigertown, Wisconsin. That is the home state where Senator Joe McCarthy came from, where the top German Nazis, American Nazis, went back and forth for Germany and funded Joe McCarthy's campaign into the Senate when he got out of the Navy. This is the headquarters of the POSSE COMITATUS, COMITATUS, in case you can't spell that or know, POSSE. And James Wickstrom is the head of it. Its size, according to the news media, is unknown. I could spend 3 hours reading to you a list of organizations that I have at home that tap right into this organization. He has 570 acres in Wisconsin, and their vigilantism is legal. Only law is the Smith & Wesson. They teach armed surveillance. They're violently anti-black. They're anti-Semitic. They're anti-tax. They're anti-big government, anti-everything American stands for. And as I mentioned last week, they're anti-Ronald Reagan. And John Hinckley Jr. was a member of the POSSE COMITATUS. And have time, I'll read you some of the articles on that in this hour. John Hinckley was part of that outfit, and they're anti-Catholic, too. And John Hinckley's family are Protestants that were moving down. They worked with the CIA and World Vision and were moving down to Central America and have been active in government espionage, counterintelligence. Their organization was a front for activity in Southeast Asia and in Africa and Central America. Now, when Gordon Call was killed in Arkansas, his murder, according to James Wickstrom, brought in tens of thousands of new members sympathetic to the organization. I don't know if it did or not, but that's what he says. Now, the POSSE COMITATUS was founded in 1953. That's a while back. The POSSE was formed in 1953, and I'm going to slip that time period into some chronology for you later. It's part of the Life Science Church. He runs a group called the Life Science Church, and the headquarters are there in Wisconsin, and it's tied into fundamentalist Christian religion. And they have in this organization, Wisconsin, a computer that connects them, 2 computers that connects them to 50 states. Now, John Reese, who works for Larry McDonald, who I mentioned before, and Louise Reese, who works for Larry McDonald, he's an aide for Larry McDonald, and they run the computers for Western goals that tap in to the Los Angeles Police Department, work with James Wickstrom and the POSSE COMITATUS and the far right-wing fundamentalist Christian groups. They're all part and parcel of the same project. The man who donated the land to Mr. Wickstrom is Donald Menishek, an unusual name unless it's a combination, Menniecheks, Menisheks. And he gave the land, the 570 acres. They have a Christian Liberty Academy, and 400 or 500 people come every weekend. There's tanks and forests to learn to fight, to learn to be aggressive and protect this country for what they think it stands for, and that is pretty dangerous. Now, along with that article, connecting this organization to something even much bigger, which takes us down to Dallas and the Kennedy assassination, is a story from the New York Times called Link Seen Among Heavily Armed Rightist Groups. This was June the 11th, 1983, by Wayne King. It's a two-page article in the New York Times, which makes the connections of Gordon Call to a Reverend William Gale, the New York Times says, whose military career includes service on General Douglas MacArthur's staff, supervising guerrilla operations in the Philippines during World War II. Now, Reverend Gale is a military officer who still keeps his military title, but he's a reverend, and he's formed his own church, a separate church. And there they teach how to make bombs, how to kill, how to ambush, and he gives lectures along with his friend from the POSSE COMITATUS. And they teach how to administer cyanide. Just to give you a little warm-up here, think of all the cyanide cases, and we'll go into those also, and how to do ambush and kill at night, how to give poisons, how to administer potassium cyanide and prussic acid, make blowguns, poison darts, wallet pistols, concealable weapons. A man that worked for them, a Mr. Saxon, S-A-X-O-N, runs his own training camp about 60 miles from where Mr. Gale was killed at the shootout. He was at the home and the barn of people who housed the POSSE COMITATUS. And Mr. Saxon worked for the American Nazi Party, for the John Birch Society. That's Larry McDonald again, and Robert Morris and H.L. Hunt, and the Minutemen, all of those people involved in the Kennedy assassination. And he worked with George Lincoln Rockwell. Lee Harvey Oswald had his name in his notebook at the time that he died, when Oswald died. But Mr. Saxon worked with all of these people, and the group is called the Identity. This is the absolute, it's known as the Identity. The Nazis, the Minutemen, the Birch Society, and they train, and Mr. Gale, who worked with Colonel Willoughby in the Philippines in guerrilla warfare, came to this country after the war and has set up in 50 states networks and also training camps in Colorado and Kansas and many of the states where the POSSE also work. These men work together. And you remember John Hinckley in Colorado and also his POSSE contacts in California. They have headquarters out here also. Now, the New York Times goes into the story of Gordon Cale, how they were investigating his murder when they came into these links of the Nazi and the Klan and the farm protest movement. The use of armed explosives, grenade launchers, automatic and semi-automatic weapons, training in guerrilla warfare tactics, stockpiling weapons in 50 states, participating in paramilitary training. The New York Times says they're violently anti-Semitic, they're rabid anti-communist, they're revisionist in terms of Christianity. The Jews are equated with bankers and communists, and members of Congress are dupes, corrupted government officials, and they say children of Jews are Satan and must be exterminated. That is one of their goals. They were former military men, trained by military men, and the New York Times tries to pass it off as if our retired military are somewhat psychotic. We're using psychotic victims to train. Well-meaning military people are training psychotics. Now, nothing could be farther from the truth. I mean, that is an outright lie. The military are training people like, say, Joseph Romero of the SLA, who was in Vietnam, or Colston Westbrook, and then they're allowed to go in the prisons and meet with police agents like Donald DeFreeze and Thero Wheeler and train them in ambush, or the men from Vietnam that were with the Manson family at the Spahn Ranch, right next, backs up to the Krupp, German Krupp Ranch in Los Angeles, where they knew they were going to kill. They were trained for killing. They knew where they were going to go. These military men are training these people. And, of course, Charles Watson comes right out of that fabric from Texas, from the Boy Scouts, the one who did the killings that Charles Manson is associated with. This is the gang with headquarters in the Mojave and elsewhere. Now, this group, Gale's group, is called the Ministry of Christ Church. It's known as the Identity, as I say, the Ministry of Christ Church. He's now a reverend. Somebody put up a lot of money for him, and they are called the Identity. Their ideological threat of bigotry, and they're linked. This New York Times story says to the POSSE Comitatus, the Christian Defense League, the Aryan Nations, the Christian Patriotic Defense, the Ku Klux Klan, the Nazi Party. I have a list of 1,800 organizations that they connect with. 1,800 that was published in 1979 with their addresses. If you want it, it's about 20 pages. I can copy it for you. This article tells how the POSSE, being extremists and with their dislike and hatred of Catholics, of the president, link up with Gale. The two men work together and speak together, have the same goals and overlap, so that while one family that housed Gordon Call is not a member of the POSSE Comitatus, he knows where to go and where to stay, and they have secret meetings around the United States and work together and train together. Now, there was that gun battle in North Dakota, as I say, where 2 marshals were killed, and then Gordon Call goes south to Arkansas, where he can stay. Now, interesting enough, the federal authorities found him through a piece of advanced equipment, an infrared airplane spotter. I know they have this equipment to look inside of houses to see where people are, and that's how they located Gordon Call, so they could test new equipment and sacrifice him at the same time. And I believe that his cyanide connections or his international connections may have been blown and may even had to do with the links in Kansas to the cyanide case, the Tylenol case, because remember, Mr. Lewis came from Kansas and had an international organization of export, import, and worked with the Internal Revenue in Kansas. And these people are anti-internal revenue, and he had a finger in that, working tax forms and so forth. And he had murdered one man in Kansas and then went north up to Illinois and was photographed in a store. And Mr. Arnold, the fellow who killed one of his witnesses last week, had books on how to put cyanide into bottles and jars. And these people are the experts on cyanide. So it could be that Gordon Call was exterminated as part of this team at the present time, and also testing those new helicopters to photograph him inside the barn. Remember, the SLA was formed for many, many reasons, and one of the things it did at the evening barbecue when 6 people were murdered on your television was to show the great SWAT team coming in to save the poor in southern Los Angeles, in a little district where they could have let them starve to death and come out, or blow out their ammunition, and everyone was cleared out. You had to get the SWAT team in all their glory at that particular time. Now, the members of Identity, the people in Arkansas who housed Call, are part of this survivalist movement. The fellow who told the fact that he was a member of Mr. Saxon of the Birch Society, the Minutemen, the Nazi Party, and so forth, he left them and was one of the founders of the survivalist movement, which includes, as I say, the ambush and the cooking, the killing of people, and chopping them up and poisoning them and so forth, and the training that they have around the country. Now, Mr. Call stayed with people from the Identity group, and Mr. Gale, Reverend Gale, right out of the Philippines with Douglas MacArthur and Willoughby, was 60 miles from where Call was killed, and he was with a member of the survivalist group, Mr. Saxon, who's the expert of all these organizations. They were just having a meeting together, of course, coincidentally. The newspaper covers these things, such a grandiose style. It's just coincidental that they were 60 miles away when Gordon Call was blown up. This Kurt Saxon was meeting with Mr. Gale. And Gale is the interesting character because in the next half hour, I'll show you how he worked with Lauren Hall and William Seymour and the people, Sylvia Odio. He worked with Mr. Eugene Bradley, who Ronald Reagan would not extradite for the grand jury, investigating the murder of John Kennedy that took place in New Orleans with Jim Garrison. Gale worked with all of these people. And so this network goes once more from the Philippines to racism, anti-Semitism, the far, far right, and the same characters end up one more time back in Dallas. We'll take a 1-minute break and then get back to that subject. Now to get back to the story of the POSSE COMITATUS, the identity movement, and the common denominators going all the way from Southeast Asia and learning guerrilla warfare in the Philippines and then bringing it back to the United States, and that is what we're getting here. Now, Reverend William Potter Gale, according to the New York Times, became the Ministry of Christ, became the Minister of Christ, and got this donation from somebody in Los Angeles, gave him a lot of money, and worked closely with the POSSE COMITATUS, formed in 1969, and up in Oregon. And the original person who founded POSSE COMITATUS was in the 1930s, before America was in the war, in the late 30s, a member of the Nazi Silver Shirts. He was the one who had the idea of protest groups against the United States government. How powerful that is to destroy our institutions here and have us fighting each other so that the plans for Adolf Hitler to take over this country would happen. He said, forget America for the time being, take South America and pass up all the Jews and the liberals, and we'll get them eventually. If we have South America, we'll be home free. We can take America. So that the Nazi Silver Shirts were working in Oregon, formed the original POSSE COMITATUS that James Wickstrom took over, and then Mr. Gale comes home from Southeast Asia, where he's learned with Colonel Charles Willoughby, whose name is Karl Wiedenbach, a German, and don't forget that. Gale comes from that environment where he works with Wiedenbach. I mentioned that article last week, Heidelberg to Madrid, and this is Heidelberg to the United States. So Reverend Gale is a minister teaching counterinsurgency seminars. According to the New York Times, they're around the country, mostly in the West and mostly in the Midwest. I'd like to know what mostly means, where else they are. Now, they described a 3-day training session in West Kansas, monitored by the Kansas Attorney General of the United States. They're not under any questioning for sabotage. You can imagine if a leftist were doing this. They're not indicted for anything. They can train poisoning, cyanide, stuffing cyanide capsules, ambushing for murder. The purpose of those ambushes is to catch people off guard, so naturally there's not going to be any witnesses. They recently had a 3-day planning session in Kansas, 56 participants, killers in hand-to-hand combat, how to administer poisons, night combat patrol, and murder by ambush. And as I say, James Lewis is from Kansas, the fellow that has been charged and was off on one murder of killing an elderly gentleman, a friend of his daughter's, who is a suspect that has not been arrested in the Tylenol, which I believe is too big to really nail him on. Roger Arnold was using those kinds of poisons. Dr. Marcus Foster was murdered in Oakland. The school, he's in charge of the school education system by a cyanide bullet, shot by Joseph Romero, home from Southeast Asia war. And Mr. Kurt Saxon told about how they trained with these cyanide bullets. Now, the seminars, the counterinsurgency seminars, are both in Wisconsin and in other places, as I say, in Colorado. And I marked the areas, the training. Springfield, Colorado is one place, and I marked the map on Kansas of the various cities to see where they're learning to do the weapons and the poisons and the training because of the location of the Tylenol suspects and John Hinckley and other persons involved in this. The New York Times said that James Wickstrom of POSSE COMITATUS and Reverend Gale, William Potter Gale, make joint appearances. And remember, a few weeks ago, about a month ago, I mentioned a radio station in Kansas City that was talking about killing blacks and Jews, violently anti-Semitic. They refer to blacks as evil beasts, and they want guerrilla warfare to fight the Jews. And they said that if anybody stopped them or took them off the air, they would kill the rabbis in Los Angeles. And I mentioned my father's a rabbi in Los Angeles. And they specifically said, we'll kill the rabbis in Los Angeles. Well, those people who said that were doing those radio programs, are part of the Wickstrom Reverend Gale group that did train in the Philippines with Willoughby, the very person that I've been trying to expose week after week. The POSSE wear camouflage military fatigues, battle. They have stockpiles of food and military operations. Now, David Emery up north, before I could even get to books on Gale, and he was linked in the New York Times to Douglas MacArthur and his learning his guerrilla work, which was under Willoughby. It was chief of intelligence under MacArthur. David Emery called me right away and said, get out your book, Power on the Right by William Turner. That was published in 1971. William has been a long investigator of the Kennedy assassination. In that book, to whet your appetite, if you don't have it, you can get the library by use one. The table of contents is the state of the right in this country, the John Birch Society that I've been talking about with Larry McDonald and Roy Cohn and John Reese, Louise Reese in the Los Angeles Police Department, Orange County, California, that's Ronald Reagan and Knott's Berry Farm, the Ku Klux Klan, the Minutemen, the paramilitary right, which is the Nazis. Each of these is a chapter. Onward Christian Soldiers, that's Carl McIntyre and his group, the Liberty Lobby, and Patrick Frawley. Ed Butler worked for Patrick Frawley and made records with Lee Harvey Oswald in military intelligence that I'm a Marxist, the American Security Council, and the police. Now, everything that Bill Turner wrote about in 1971, every chapter, comes together now with the Birch Society and their computers in the 50 police departments. In this book, he mentions that not until the assassination of John Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, did the political gravity of this nation shift to the right. That was 20 years ago this November. That was a coup d'etat, and that is when the shift took place. And he mentions right-wing people that were behind Lyndon Johnson. He was their protege, like George and Herman Brown, of Brown and Root, Clint Murchison, and H.L. Hunt. Hunt funded the Birch Society and linked with Warren Carroll of the CIA and the Young Americans for Freedom. George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Marina Oswald's contacts, was an employee of the Defense Department and Brown and Root. And then Penn Jones wrote his books on the murder of important witnesses and told how J. Edgar Hoover was at the home of Clint Murchison the night before John Kennedy was murdered, when the FBI and the top people agreed they go ahead with the kill the next day. He talks about how the right process was hastened with the assassinations in 1968 of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy Jr., both passionately despised by the far right. That goes into Robert Byron Watson's experiences in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Art Gallery, and Mr. Youngblood and the agents involved in those murders. In this book, he talks about the John Birch Society, God, Family, and Country Rally at the 4th of July in Boston, and Billy James Hargis of the Christian Crusade, and he mentions certain people from Liberty Lobby and so forth. But he has the quotations in this book that I've referred to from American Opinion. There was a professor, Revillo P. Oliver, and he was from the University of Illinois, and won Boston at the time of 4th of July celebrations in 1966. He got up, and the head of the Birch Society, got up and praised Oliver. He just turned over his mantle to Larry McDonald. But at the time, he praised Mr. Oliver as being the finest person, a great intellectual, one of the great intellectuals of our time. This was a John Birch Society annual meeting on the 4th of July. And Oliver wrote for the Birch Society. And at the speech, he referred to blacks as mangy cannibals in Africa. And then he talked in 1966 at the Conference on Family and Country Rally by saying the vaporizing of Jews was a beatific vision. And Mr. Robert Welch, turned over the mantle with his records and the police records of Robert Morris and the Birch Society and the House Un-American Activities and the Senate investigating committees that Joe McCarthy had, all to computers. The LAPD I mentioned specifically because of the Olympics and the terror that could come down there that I refer to often, the importance of Mr. Welch giving this material. And these kinds of people, data banks on Americans. Well, Bill Turner talks about this group of right-wing people, but in the section on the paramilitary right, he tells about his interviews with various members of the Minutemen, a Dennis Maurer, M-O-W-E-R. He said Maurer is a minister of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, Christ-Christian, whose reigning dignitary is the Reverend Wesley A. Swift, W-E-S-L-E-Y, A. Swift, of Lancaster, California. 3 decades ago, Swift was part of the Gerald L. K. Smith Christian Nationalist Crusade and a rifle team instructor for the Ku Klux Klan. They have a group in Florida they call the Eastern Conference. The church has a group, and they ran the campaign for Admiral John Crommelin, C-R-O-M-M-E-L-I-N, of Alabama, who was against the Jewish communist conspiracy at the time. The SWIFT complex includes the Christian Defense League, the CTL, which are white Christians run by a group including Mr. Conrad Connie Lynch of the Minutemen, and the Church of Jesus Christ Christian also connects to Mr. Gale. And on page 102, they bring up the name of Mr. Gale. It said one of the driving forces of this is the Christian Defense League, this group. In its early days was Lieutenant Colonel William P. Gale, Lieutenant Colonel, he's also the Reverend now, who had trained guerrilla bands in the Philippines during World War II. In the late 1950s, he formed a paramilitary California Rangers. Now, Douglas MacArthur was fired by Harry Truman because of his radicalism and his want to use atomic bombs in Asia. And along with him, when he left in 1951, Gale left, Willoughby left the team, and Gale left the team. And Gale comes to California. Willoughby goes to Madrid, Spain, to work with Franco and set up American bases in Franco. And Mr. Gale begins in the 50s, in the late 50s, setting up a California Rangers, which the California Attorney General's office said was designed as a secret underground guerrilla force. Now, they've been underground since the 50s, but it's 1983, and they're very visible now with their training and their tanks and their computers. In 1963, a wealthy Los Angeles benefactor put money in the Christian Defense League, and Gale then tried his hand at improving his fortune, so he became a minister of Mr. Swift's. And you see some of these television ministers who worked with J. Peter Grace and military intelligence and have his unlimited money. Well, here's one man who came right out of the Philippines with Willoughby and Douglas MacArthur, who has a rich benefactor. Now, in that time period, from 50 to 60s, the Martin Bormann money, the Nazi money, was being distributed out of Madrid, and Colonel Willoughby is in Madrid. As soon as he's fired and leaves the army, he quits with Douglas MacArthur. He then goes on to Madrid and is active with Franco and the government, setting up the bases there. So who knows what kind of money made this particular colonel at this point, Lieutenant Colonel Gale, a minister. He's still doing that shtick as a minister, training armies to kill and running radio stations on vaporizing and murdering in this country. This story says the Christian Defense League had a security system and files that extend to every state of the Union. Now, those are those files again in the hands of the police department of John Reese, Louise Reese, Larry McDonald, the Birch Society, the Minutemen, the American Nazi Party. Those files were in the hands of Gale, and he came right out of Willoughby's counterintelligence. Willoughby coming from Frankfurt, Spain, from Germany, and working with Franco. In 1936, he was teaching an Army military college in the United States, praising Franco. It says that he had lists for the Christian Defense League, and they reported on their organizations, and their sister organization on the West Coast was the National States Rights Party with George Lincoln Rockwell, again linked to Robert Morris and Lee Harvey Oswald and so forth. Oswald was a right-winger. The Christian Defense League was run by a man named G. Clinton Wheat. Now, he was one of the people that worked with Gale, who had come from the Philippines. He worked with Clinton Wheat. One of those who attended their meetings was Lauren Eugene Hall, an anti-Castro adventurer who used an alias at the meetings. He was mentioned in the Warren Commission report in connection with information supplied by Sylvia Odio. Sylvia Odio worked with Lauren Hall and Mr. Seymour, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's double, and used the name Leopoldo, was introduced to Sylvia Odio and Leon Oswald, and they were talking about having a sure shot to kill John Kennedy prior to the assassination. Mrs. Odio was called before the Warren Commission, but those men were never checked out, and all of these men worked with, not only with Sylvia Odio, but with the Marines, with the anti-Castro Cubans, with the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, this goes back, these men, keep in mind, worked with Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, and Frank Sturgis and Bernard Barker, the whole gang that was caught at Watergate and then surfaced later with Corcola and Turple. That was Edwin Wilson, one of the paymasters of the Bay of Pigs. This book by Bill Turner says the FBI investigated the intriguing aspect of the Warren Commission report. that said on September the 16th, 1964, the FBI located Lauren Eugene Hall in Johnsdale, California, Johnsondale, Johnsondale in California. Hall was identified as a participant in anti-Castro activities. He told the FBI that in September of 1963, he was in Dallas soliciting help of the anti-Castro Cubans. He had visited Sylvia Odio. He was accompanied by Lawrence Howard and William Seymour from Arizona, and that Seymour is similar to appearance to Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, it was always that Seymour that I believed was working with the anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans when they said Oswald had a gruffy appearance and beard and sat with people from the far right. The other Oswald was clean-shaven and appeared at the Riley Coffee Company, which was also a franchise of Mullen Associates in Washington, D.C., run by E. Howard Hunt and Douglas Caddy, the Young Americans for Freedom. Caught at the time of Watergate, it was out of those offices of Mullen Associates that they had their finger in the till down at Riley Coffee. But Oswald didn't have two appearances in New Orleans, clean-shaved and beard. And this Lee Harvey Oswald double was roving around with the anti-Castro Cubans who worked with the Christian Defense League and with Gale and with the counterintelligence operations in California. Now, Bill Turner wrote, he says that not only were they working with Mr. Wheat and with the church group, this was Seymour and Howard and Lauren Hall, but they confirmed they worked with Edgar Eugene Bradley and Dr. Stanley Drennan, Drennan. The West Coast representative, Dr. Carl McIntyre. Bradley was indicted by New Orleans grand jury in December 1968. That's when Jim Garrison wanted to get the grand jury to ask him where he was in his role in the murder of John Kennedy. He was a suspect in the murder to have killed John Kennedy, but the case was never brought to trial because Governor Ronald Reagan refused to approve extradition. Now, Ronald Reagan has been put in by Willoughby, by Gale, by the Christian Defense League, by all of these organizations. And again, the structure for them, the money, came from the Falange money from Madrid to the Philippines, from the Philippines to California. And California, Willoughby is part of Young Americans for Freedom in 1960 with Ronald Reagan and Robert Morris and the people that were to bring over agents from Munich, Germany, for the hate on John Kennedy. Now, they mention another person in this book, Bill Turner does. Along with these people was Captain Robert Kenneth Brown, who of the School Brigade in Fort Benning, Georgia. Mr. Russell of the Warren Commission, Senator Russell, was from Georgia. Robert Byron Watson talks about the Larry McDonald team, the syndicate from Georgia behind these murders. Robert Kenneth Brown from the School Brigade in Fort Benning, Georgia, was part of the Cuban matter and admitted in spring of 1963 that he worked with the anti-Castro people and with the National States Right Party in Los Angeles, California. Now, Mr. Brown, if you've never seen his picture, I have it in the book, The Silencers, Snipers, and Assassins. His picture is in that book. He's co-author. It's called An Overview of Whispering Death. In May of 1977, you know how many years ago that was, in 1977, broadcast 267, I was referring to the book Silencers, the CIA, and how the House Select Committee or the other investigators on the murder of John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King never, ever, ever have addressed themselves to silencers. Now, the man who wrote the book, the man who worked with William Donovan of OSS and the CIA, who worked with the anti-Castro Cubans, who worked with the organizations that are linked directly to the Kennedy murder, his expertise is these silencers. Now, there were silencers in Dealey Plaza. You don't have to look at the book depository for that fatal headshot on John Kennedy. There was a silencer out in front of the Lorraine Motel. Martin Luther King was shot from the street with a heavy gun, and James Earl Ray was not in the rooming house. There was a silencer in the Ambassador Hotel. Thane Caesar is seen holding a gun 1 inch from the head of Robert Kennedy, where the autopsy says the burn mark was. He falls to the ground. The shots are in back. Now, this book on Whispering Death tells about William Donovan in the White House with Franklin Roosevelt, and while Roosevelt looks down, he's shooting 10 shots into a bag on the floor of sand, and the president doesn't know it, and he shows them the gun. So if you can sit with the president of the United States and shoot a gun with silencer and he doesn't know it, you can certainly pull it in a mob scene in front of the Lorraine Motel or the Ambassador Hotel. Incidentally, the book on silencers has Chapter 3 that might whet your appetite. Silencers in World War II, the OSS, the Resistance, the Gestapo, and Otto Skorzeny. So Mr. Brown, who is the co-author of that book and runs a printing establishment for weapons and so forth in Colorado, you may know it. It's the Paladin Press, and I can give you the address. You can write to me in case you don't have those books. I have their brochures and books. This Mr. Brown from Georgia is linked to Mr. Bradley, to the groups that killed John Kennedy. And Bill Turner says Brown was no newcomer to paramilitary circles. He joined the Troy Houghton maneuvers in the Mexican border, Houghton. He was an insider in the Miami colony of Cuban exiles, and it was the same group, as I say, with Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, Frank Turple, George Corcola, and Richard Nixon was in charge of the Bay of Pigs operation also. Brown runs a publication in Boulder, Colorado on guerrilla warfare. Now, in comes Gale, whose name is in the New York Times this week, trained in guerrilla warfare with Colonel Charles Willoughby. Gale becomes a reverend, runs a church, and runs a bookstore in Colorado with these silencers and ways to kill. Bill Turner has in his book how Lauren Hall had worked and lived in Havana and left there, and in 1967 Life was investigating the John Kennedy assassination. And Mr. Brown, the man, the expert on silencers, when silencers were murdered, and George Corcola, incidentally, worked with Mitchell Werbel and the same silencers that Mr. Brown used. They were manufactured by Mitchell Werbel, also in Georgia, in DeKalb County, where Larry McDonald comes from. It said Life magazine was looking into the murder of John Kennedy, and Brown worked with Life reporters on the involvement of anti-Castro Cubans. So here is a guy whose expertise is the Gestapo, Otto Skorzeny, the OSS, silencers, helping Life magazine with an issue on the anti-Castro Cubans when he himself worked for them. And Bill Turner says in his book on the right wing, he says plans for sniping John Kennedy were common talk among the paramilitary long before 1963. One plan was formulated in 1960 while Kennedy was still campaigning. Now, how many times over again am I illustrating to you that when Robert Mayu set up the assassination teams with John Rosselli and Sam Giancana in 1960, Kennedy was always the target. And I sincerely believe that any candidate who won against Richard Nixon would have been off. Richard Nixon in the 50s brought in the Iron Guard. In the 40s, he brought in the Nazis from Project Paperclip. He worked with the organized crime syndicate with Murray Chotiner and the drug traffic people. He was the perfect Nazi drug narcotic agent. And he was handpicked for the House of Representatives. Then he was in the Senate and prosecuted Alger Hiss and made himself famous playing around with that evidence, was the vice president under Eisenhower. And no way, after all that, were they going to lose their man. And they had planned Kennedy's death. They gave him a choice to invade Cuba. When he pulled back, then the anti-Castro Cubans were right there with him. And in conclusion, in this book on the right wing that Bill Turner wrote, it tells again about the Christian Defense League. Gale is here in the 1950s. He's in Northern California in 1965, working with this group, and District Attorney Jim Garrison wanted these people as material witnesses. A deep split had developed between Wesley Smith and Colonel Gale. After running for governor of the Constitution Party in 1966, Gale was part of the clique with Edgar Eugene Bradley and melded in with Dennis Maurer and the Minutemen and so forth. So that Gale was a part of that team from the 50s. When Willoughby left Southeast Asia with the guerrilla trading, he came to California and set up these national organizations and worked with William Seymour and Sylvia Odia and Lawrence Hall and people that the House Select Committee once again covered up. And they worked with Mr. Brown, Major Robert K. Brown, and there are pictures of him with his submachine gun with psionic silencers. The whole book is on silencers. On Mr. Robert K. Brown, editor and publisher of Paladin Press, holding another one of his silencers, the story of his working in the OSS with various people who developed the silencers. They were made by Chrysler Corporation and General Motors. Wouldn't you know that they were one of the first group in with the silencers? Well, as I said before, John Hinckley Jr. covered bases of these particular people in his past with the Nazi Party and with the POSSE Comitatus. Now, in January of 1981, there was an interview with me about me in the San Francisco Chronicle. And in that article, it was about 1/3 of a page. It was a picture of me and my allegations that the Nazis were behind these various assassinations, the Minutemen, the Nazis, and the Klan. And shortly after that was when that car was in front of my house. And I took the license plate and called, as soon as March happened and Ronald Reagan was shot, I called the FBI and Secret Service and said I had told my son there's a Nazi in front of our house. I took the driver's license, the name. They didn't believe me. And then it turned out later that he had links with the POSSE Comitatus in this state, with the Nazi Party in the state. And finally, your federal agents came to my home because the car license that I had was a person who was a member of an organization that John Hinckley was associated with. And the organization was the POSSE Comitatus. So that was just a couple of years ago, 1981. The years go so fast. And at John Hinckley's trial, they tried to say that he was a loner and he was crazy. But I had written down all the various cities and places where he knew people and made calls. And one of the points of the article in the New York Times was that the identity group, the Nazis, the Klan, the POSSE, all protect each other. If you're on the lam, if you need a place today to stay, they protect each other. Well, John Hinckley made 6 calls from Tennessee when he was there. He was in Washington and took pictures of the White House. He was at New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale 2 different times. He made phone calls from his hotel room in Washington, D.C. He was at the International Airport in Los Angeles, from Denver. And I have a list, and there's no time, 1 minute left, of all the various places where he was seen making calls from phone booths, making calls from the hotel rooms, receiving messages. That had to be the POSSE Comitatus. It had to be the identity movement. The goals were the same. They hated Ronald Reagan, and more of that will come out later. So there is a connection, once again, to the guerrilla work, the Philippines, and going right back to Dallas. The same people, and they're in the news today because they are well armed now, and they're in 50 states. I always told you should try and find out who killed John Kennedy, and you'd know what's going on in the world. Well, our hour's up now. You've got a lot of information for 1 hour. I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.